Well, I'm talking with Dr. Brion McClanahan. He's written several books, including The Politically Incorrect Guide to Real American Heroes, which I'm finding fascinating because there's some myths that have been busted in my mind because of all of this. And I think you just may find out that there's some things that you thought you knew that you didn't know, and things you didn't know that you should know. All right, let's put it that way. Dr. McClanahan, welcome.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I have a question that kind of underlies the rather, there's some humorous parts of this book, I think, for sure, but I think there's some serious things that we can learn about as well. We think of our educational system and what people are being taught these days as truth, and sometimes you wonder, is it really consistent in our educational system? And so the question I have is, are there a lot of myths you're finding about that people think they know about some of our American heroes and people of Americana that are just wrong? Are there a lot of myths out there?
Well, I think it's more on the other way, the people that we call heroes who really aren't, and that's actually the second part of the book where I have the fraudulent heroes. The heroes that I bring up in the first section of the book, the first 12 chapters basically, I mean, these people either are marginalized and they're not discussed at all. I mean, some of them, for example, like Charles Lindbergh, who is often characterized as a Nazi sympathizer, which isn't true. I mean, that is one myth that I think we can effectively bust. But for the most part, it's people like Woodrow Wilson and Franklin Roosevelt, people that we would call heroes today, who really aren't, that have done great damage to the United States, great damage to the Constitution. Those are the people that the left likes to trumpet about and say, well, these people are our heroes. These people are the individuals who have brought us the America that we know and love. And I would say, well, I mean, if you want to talk about executives who have run over the Constitution in ways that, my gosh, would just make you shudder, that's these people, Wilson and Roosevelt. And then, of course, you have some people like Margaret Sanger, who's often portrayed as this great feminine hero. And there are just some problems with her character and some of the things she did as well. So I think that's really the issue that we have in American education today. Usually the great men and women are marginalized and replaced with people who are less than savory.
Okay, so it's not necessarily what we're told about them, it's what we're not told about them that you're looking at. And
exactly.
You have mentioned some of the people that I want to talk about. In fact, one of those initially was the issue of Charles Lindbergh. I remember hearing that he had Nazi tendencies and was an anti-Semite. That's how it really came down to all of that, which, you know, after you hear about what Charles Lindbergh did and all the rest, that kind of came as a sad note. But you say that's not true.
No, actually, if you look at the information that's available, his diaries and everything else, Lindbergh never said anything that was considered anti-Semitic. There was one speech he gave in Des Moines, Iowa, where he mentioned that there were essentially three groups who were bringing the United States into war, and one of those groups was Jewish Americans. And he actually wrote a note in his speech before he gave it. He didn't say this, but he said, "I'm going where angels fear to tread," because he understood that when he said that the Jewish American community was help pushing the United States into war, that he was going to be vilified for that. And of course, what happened is the Roosevelt administration put a full court press, so to speak, on Lindbergh because he was actively trying to keep the United States out of World War II. He had spent time in Germany. He did receive a medal from the Nazi German government in the company of Roosevelt officials. And he told them about it, and they said they had no problem with it. So it wasn't until Lindbergh became an outspoken opponent of United States entrance into the war that he was painted as this anti-Semitic Nazi sympathizer. And again, this was the government, the full resources of the government going to play against Lindbergh. My gosh, I mean, what American citizen can stand up against that? And even to this day, Lindbergh is characterized as that. I heard just a few months back on a radio interview where the guest was calling Lindbergh, this unpatriotic American, this pro-Nazi sympathizer. It's just simply not true. Lindbergh did admire the German people, but he never said anything nice about Adolf Hitler. It's just a crazy distortion of history.
Wow, and from your book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Real American Heroes, about Lindbergh, you, as I recall, tell me if I'm wrong on this, when he was given that award from Nazi Germany, he was not expecting it. It was kind of one of those political things that they had a public gathering. He was there being commended for something, and then they just gave it to him without him knowing about that. Is that right?
That's exactly right. He had no clue this was going to be done that day. And so he gets the award. He writes, should I accept this thing? Should I keep it? And of course, the Roosevelt administration said, yeah, sure, fine. He was actually in Germany looking at the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, to to try to ascertain what kind of military capabilities they had. So if the United States was going to end up fighting Germany, what were they looking at here? And so Lindbergh was actually acting as sort of like a spy for the Roosevelt administration. It's amazing how quickly things changed once he came back home and said, you know, I really don't think we should get involved in this war. And that's usually what the government does when they figure out somebody's against their position. They pull out all the stops to try to destroy them.
Yeah. In your book, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Real American Heroes, you talk about a lot of people like George Custer, Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, a whole lot of people who we perhaps think that we know about, but maybe we don't. I think your book will shed some light on that. Let's continue what you were talking about, though, with Franklin Roosevelt, about his administration. What is it that we should or shouldn't know? Well, I suppose we should know everything. What do we need to have corrected, let's put it that way, about his administration and World War II, really?
I think it's his entire administration. You know, Roosevelt is such a transformational figure. If you're going to talk about the latter half of the 20th century in the United States, you have to deal with Roosevelt. Even if you talk about modern America, you have to deal with Roosevelt. And unfortunately, since in the last 40 years, most of the history is written about Roosevelt are going to be rather positive. There were people in the late 40s and early 50s who were writing some fairly accurate assessments of the Roosevelt administration. For example, Charles Tansel, who wrote a wonderful book entitled Backdoor to War, where he was very critical of the Roosevelt administration leading into World War II. And he, of course, was blacklisted by the historical profession because of this. But Roosevelt, everything about him is wrong. And when you read modern history texts in so many ways, I mean, for example, you're going to see that Roosevelt saved the United States with the New Deal, which the New Deal only prolonged the Depression. You're going to read that Roosevelt reluctantly got us into World War II. He's trying so hard to keep us out. But those rascally Japanese, of course, attacked us just unprovoked. They didn't do anything here. We were completely caught off guard by the Japanese, and we were just minding our own business in Hawaii, and all of a sudden the Japanese attacked on December 7th, which is just completely preposterous. You know, the United States was goading the Japanese into attacking the entire month of November, and even before that, this was a deliberate policy, a provocation policy. And so when the United States was ultimately attacked on December 7th, Roosevelt knew it was coming. In fact, his George Marshall, who was his main chief of staff at the time, was out riding his horse, knowing full well that perhaps the attack was coming that day, and nobody could find him. Roosevelt was in his library with his telephone off, his music on, studying his stamp collection. He never did that kind of thing. You know, so he was never out of contact. But just so happens this particular time, when the Japanese are going to attack the United States, Roosevelt's unavailable. So he knew it was coming. This was a deliberate step by the United States to get involved in the war. And then, of course, the New Deal, if Roosevelt had actually done what he should have done, and actually what he said he was going to do in the 32 campaign, which was cut taxes and cut spending, the Great Depression might have ended, say, in 1933 or 1934, but it continues even up and past World War II. So Roosevelt's an unmitigated disaster, and of course then you get in the issues of concentration camps and other things that were established during the war. He's just such an important person to tear down, and of course usually recognized as one of the top 3 presidents in American history, unfortunately.
Let me ask you, in the few minutes that we have, what do you think are the main reasons for some of these revisions of history, perhaps, or alterations? Is it as concerted, or is it benign?
Well, I think it's definitely a concerted effort to change American history. You know, for example, in 2009, when Barack Obama was inaugurated, he said we're going to keep remaking America, and I think that the historical profession is part of that. If you can change the way people think about history, you know, George Orwell was right on this. You know, if you can change the way people think about the past, you can change the way people conduct themselves in the present, and then, of course, you can change the future that way. So if you're going to elevate leftist heroes, if you're going to elevate, make Franklin Roosevelt out to be this great president, and everything he did when it comes to domestic policy or foreign policy was completely justified, even going so far as the Supreme Court declaring that you can have war powers beyond a war, which is what we had. You know, even after World War II is over, the government is still doing everything it could in the terms of war powers to ensure that their hegemony, the federal government, was maintained when the war was over. If you can do that, if you can change the way people think about the executive branch, the way people think about social causes, the way people think about economics, you can change their activities now, and you can change their activities at the ballot box. So I think that if some of the people that I discuss in the book were elevated back to their proper status, you know, these entrepreneurs, individuals, people who are out there doing things on their own blood and hook, you're going to change the perspective of American history, and that's what I'm trying to do in the book.
Well, fascinating. And you hit not just political figures also, but people who have had social impact on the nation as well, right?
Absolutely. I mean, for example, one of my most favorite chapters is the chapter I entitled Underdogs with Booker T. Washington and Samuel B. Fuller. So you have Booker T. Washington. People have heard the name before, but they don't know much about him. Here's an individual born in slavery, was finally given his freedom in 1865. He and his family walked across the state of Virginia, where he worked, and then he worked in a coal mine, wanted an education. Actually, when he was working in that particular mine, would set the clock forward so he could get to school on time. I mean, how many school children would do that today? So he's trying to get to school, and then he decides he wants to get a college education, so he walks across the state of Virginia again so he can go to college, runs out of money, has to sleep under a sidewalk, and takes a job unloading pig iron. When he finally gets to the college, his entrance exam was sweeping the classroom, and so he did it very, very well. And he gets into school, and of course, the rest is history. Becomes a great teacher and an advocate for Black Americans in the United States, but in a way that the modern civil rights community wouldn't recognize as being beneficial. He said people need to get a job and money. They need to make money, and if they have a decent income and economic power, they're going to have a larger role in society. So never was a race baiter, was always a unifier. And so I think these are people that we need to talk about. I mean, as social champions in a way that we don't have today.
Yeah, amazing. The Politically Incorrect Guide to Real American Heroes, the latest book from Dr. Brion McClanahan. I appreciate that. Thanks for being with us today.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.